I'm sure we're all aware TV isn't just on the TV anymore. There's some debate about whether TV is in fact, when it's not on the TV, is in fact TV anymore. But this is just sort of to raise the issue which we deal with on a daily basis of multiple screens, divided attention. Multiple devices, so you've got the big screen in the corner of the room, you've got a medium-sized screen on your lap, you've got a tiny screen in your pocket or in your hand, and you have a different relationship with all of them, and the way you use all of them is different. Subtly sometimes it doesn't feel very different to you, but believe me, it is. And how content appears on those therefore has to be configured differently, and how you might feel about the content that we put on those might differ as well, and we'll talk about that a bit further on. In the current world we're in, there is kind of limitless choice of stuff to do. So the realm I'm in terms of multi-platform commissioning is not just TV commissioning. I'm not looking at other TV broadcasters only. I'd look at them, of course, but not solely as the competition. I'm looking at everything on the internet, and when you put it into that kind of context, that's massive. So in terms of access to content and stories, however loosely you define that, it's pretty broad, which has resulted in a distracted and distractible audience. So one of the big challenges that we have around any of our genres and multi-platform commissioning is how do you attract their attention and hold it for a sustained period of time? And that sustained period of time might be for the duration of a broadcast of an episode, but more and more, it's about over a long period of time, over a period of weeks, sometimes months, to keep them engaged with you as a program brand or as a broadcast brand. And there's some significant challenges with that. So one of the things that comes as a result of this distributed attention is diverse attention patterns. So the way people consume different types of media on those different devices varies hugely. There's a great deal of difference between checking your phone at the bus stop to sitting down to dedicate a weekend to watching a box set of The Wire. Very, very different type of attention span. Very different type of attention span between watching something on a commercial channel that has ad breaks to a public service broadcaster like the BBC that doesn't have commercial breaks. Again, you have a different pattern of attention of when you're paying attention and when you're perhaps breaking away from that. And also between genre, different types of attention pattern are required by different types of TV genre. A documentary, or particularly something current affairs, something quite weighty, will require more sustained attention than an entertainment format. A drama will ask of you more sustained attention than a comedy show, perhaps a sitcom. A friend of mine commented quite recently at a couple of conferences, a show like The X Factor is a fantastic example of a TV show that's made for split attention. It assumes that you're not watching the show the whole time that you're sitting in front of it on the sofa. That's why they recap throughout the show, that really infuriating recap where if you're watching it and you're not really doing anything else, it's really boring. Assumes that you didn't catch all the stuff, and it assumes you didn't even catch the earlier recap. And these are TV shows that are designed for this kind of split attention. And the attention patterns of where people go and what people do around content differs as well. And those differences we used to define by age. So we used to kind of, Facebook's for the young. Actually, it wasn't Facebook, but back in the day it was MySpace, it's for the young. Bebo, for the young. It's not anymore. It's really not anymore. Games are not just for the young. Social media is definitely not just for the young. TV is for everybody. And it's much more about lifestyle in terms of access to content and the sorts of program they're watching, life stage in terms of time available, and interest. Actually, the one thing I didn't put out there, sort of specialist interest. So we're less sort of limited by just putting things on the internet for the kids. So some examples of different types of viewing behaviour. So there's live viewing or linear viewing or TX, if I slip into any of those words, that's what I mean, which basically refers to when the programme goes out, at the time it's scheduled, the thing that you see in the EPG. Event TV are things like X Factor finals, big moments that have a huge build-up. Sports events are really key in this one. They're the things you're not going to record, really. They're the things that really only matter if you're watching live. There's catch-up viewing, which we're all familiar with, and that can be via a PVR, so that's sort of something like Sky Plus or Virgin Media, or online, video on demand in a variety of guises. And there's binge and box set viewing, where you've either series linked something via your TV, or you've bought a box set or downloaded or whatever, and it's sitting watching a huge chunk, so hours and hours and hours of content all back to back. There's snacking, so those small pieces, catching bits of content here and there. And threaded through all of these, to be honest, is two screen, and more than two screen, which is where you're watching one screen with content and you're fiddling with another screen, generally, is the general model at the moment of what people are doing. The classic is people watching TV and texting at the same time, or Facebook at the same time. And it's huge. It's a huge, huge deal. So one of the things I wanted to just, a concept, the things that we think about, is that telling and sharing stories creates identity and culture. Telling stories and listening to stories and paying attention to stories is how we understand who we are as individuals, as groups, as small social groups, as wider social groups, as communities. So there's a huge amount of impact in telling stories in different ways it may have on us as individuals and as a culture. There's something really interesting happening around reinventing the shared sofa, around two-screen viewing. People who are watching on their own are no longer on their own. And one of the things I reflect on quite often is a lot of the issues that we think are new to us because of this split attention are not that new, really. People have always been watching TV on the sofa, and if they're watching with more than one person, they're not giving the programme, frequently not giving the programme their sole attention. They're talking to the person next to them on the sofa. We've just never been able to measure it before. We've never had that return path. And having private conversations in public. That's really interesting, because it makes other things measurable and more immediately measurable. We're no longer relying just on overnight figures to try and guess whether people liked a show or watched it because it was so bad it's good, or dropped out halfway through or whatever. We can actually see their actual words in real time. And a lot of our producers at Channel 4 would habitually watch Twitter for the hashtag or just the name of their programme while it was airing to get an immediate kind of response. Now, if you're working in drama, that can be exhilarating or it can be absolutely devastating, because your programme is already in the can and already in the building. If you're working on a live show format, that's an incredibly useful tool to be able to tweak your show in response to audience activity and audience feedback while that show's going on air. There's a lot of interesting stuff as well around building communities around programme brands, which we can talk about and maybe address in the Q&A. And something I also wanted to just raise, which is impact on drama as well, I think, and perhaps more than we think about, but definitely has an impact around entertainment programming, which is people play games at home, and people have always played games on the sofa. It's what you do when you're watching a murder mystery programme. You're trying to guess who the killer is. It's what you do when you read an Agatha Christie book. You're trying to see if you can get there before Poirot or Marple does. You're playing games. You're creating little transactions in your head that are playful. We did a really interesting piece of research around the £1 Million Drop, which has a play-along game that we've built, that Channel 4 had built. And one of the interesting pieces that came out of the quant research was that people played that game, but they played other games as well. And some of those games involved putting cash money down on the table in the living room, and exchanging money for points with each other, with games that they'd sort of made up around the programme. So there's something about the programme and an invitation to interact with it that makes it kind of a social object, which is also really interesting. I mentioned this before, but I like Queenie's photo, so that's not just for the young. There are a lot of people playing along. But I think there are still some things that haven't gone. This is not a TV is dead presentation. TV is very, very much not dead. I'm not a geek coming in to say everything's changed. At heart, we fundamentally still love to be told a good story, whether that story is a documentary, a current affairs piece, a really well-crafted drama. And we still want to hear it, and our participation is that kind of sign of wanting more, of wanting to engage with it even more. It's not just public broadcasters who are getting into the swing of things. So we have brands most recently have been commissioning some really, really high quality pieces of content. And so I just wanted to post this up as a bit of an example of taking a brand that was a public service brand, funnily enough, with Alan Partridge, and spinning it out as a piece of content that is commercialised, that was commissioned by a beer company. I think that's really interesting. So I suppose this comes back to my question, which is about telling stories and sharing stories as a means to creating our sense of identity and our culture around ourselves, because if they're doing it, who owns these stories which we're telling? And that was it. That was a lot.
I was one of 53 commissioned artists to produce work for The Space. The Space was funded by the Arts Council, and the BBC, I guess, offered kind of mentoring support, gave the technical kind of support, and also guided us, I guess. The Space, if you haven't seen it, really, I call it the glorified iPlayer, which I don't think they would probably like me saying, but that's how it feels to me. And it's also, it's very specifically an arts hub. Okay, so if you want to know about literature, music, film, this is the platform the BBC were really trying to invest in. I've heard lots of people today talking about reasons for the BBC going digital and trying to push their content in different ways, and that's really interesting for me to hear, because it felt like such a new idea when I was speaking to them, but it seems like there's other motives for this related to their survival as well. The idea behind The Space was to create content that could be accessible on numerous different types of devices. Very much like we've just heard here, they wanted stuff that was specific for a mobile phone, stuff that could be engaged with through social media, mixtures of film, written word, images, etc. So it was a really interesting project to get involved in, because I had to really think differently about how I produce content, and as a journalist I've been very used to producing things on a simple page. So maybe if I show you what this is, that'll help explain what I did. I did a thing called the Sillitoe Trail, which basically is creating a literary landscape of Alan Sillitoe's Saturday Night and Sunday Morning. If you're not too sure what that book's about, very briefly, a randy factory worker gets drunk a lot and has sex with a few women and then settles down in a house. That's the digested read. A little bit more exciting than that though. So I've really had to think about how can we produce this for this platform when I was putting in my initial pitch. And I really like the idea of thinking about how relevant the themes of 1958 were in 2012. So I took 5 locations from the novel, and at each location explored a theme related to that area. So we started off with the old Market Square, which is where people traditionally meet up in Nottingham if they're going out for a drink, and that's where Arthur would meet some of his girls. And when I put this together, Market Square was occupied by the Occupy movement. And one of the key themes in Saturday Night, Sunday Morning is don't let the bastards grind you down. So I thought, who are the bastards in 2012? Has anything really changed? So we used this space to explore rebellion in Nottingham over the centuries, and then think, who are the bastards in 2012? And that's when I ran up against my first little problem with the BBC, because there was concern that if I suggested that rich bankers and politicians were bastards, then it could cause them a bit of problem. But as I pointed out, they are bastards, so I don't quite understand what the point is. But there was that general, I guess, fear of creating something that could cause a lot of trouble. Now in my eyes, this is a direct quote from the book, and it's my kind of job as a digital storyteller, if you like, to reimagine that and take that theme. So I didn't see anything too bad about that, but that was one initial kind of problem that I had. So what works with the narrative, it goes through the 5 different locations of the novel and explores one in lots of different ways. So I had a jazz band, which you can see in the corner there, who did music from the 1950s to kind of create that atmosphere of the novel. This man here, Derek Buttress, was particularly proud to commission him for the project because he was 80 years old and he'd just released his first short story collection. So I got him to do 5 essays on the market square around that period and just before. And I thought that was a lovely way for the space to actually start, because it was kind of like the old coming in with the new. The remit for the space was to be as interactive as possible, to be as diverse as possible, and I think I've more than fulfilled that by having poets, historians, beatboxers, jazz musicians, photography, film, everything. But the interactivity, I don't think it quite came off as good as it could have done, to be honest with you. And the reason for that, I would say, is because the BBC was still a gatekeeper. I would produce certain content, and of course they're uploading it, and that wasn't the impression that I had when I went for the commission. I thought we would be able to move all of this content around, like Twitter feeds, for example. When a post went up, I wanted a Twitter feed on here so that we could interact with the content and have a dialogue. But I guess because of concerns about monitoring, if we had the time to do that, if anything was done that was slanderous, they kind of pulled back from that a little bit. So that was a little bit of an issue. Another thing with the space, if you look at the logo, when they talked about it being really kind of three-dimensional and working across platforms, I had an image of this kind of block coming out that you would turn around and you would pull things out. So again, this is still linear to me. It's not popping out in your face. Now this may sound as I'm being really ungrateful and critical of the BBC. I'm not. It was an absolutely fantastic opportunity to work with them. The contacts I made for it, the mentoring programs they taught me, has really changed how I now write as a journalist. They put on lots of kind of mentoring sessions, how to use Twitter. I know that must sound really silly, how do you use Twitter if you're a professional Twitter user, but I never thought of it, for example, as an archiving system, and the way that I could use that to really think about the work of Alan Sillitoe in a different way. So one thing I did was I started to tweet all of the books by Alan Sillitoe, and I found that really, really interesting because it put me in the position of a curator where I had to think about what text worked, what quotes worked, and it allowed me to really reimagine a novel in a completely different format in a way that I don't think had really been done before. So lots of things came out of the space that were definitely to our benefit. Another slight problem with it though is because it happened so fast, because there was so much content going online, I don't think that they had enough resources or the technology ready to kind of deal with this volume of content. But as I was talking to a couple of people before, I'm a big believer that if you don't actually do something, nothing will happen. You can sit and plan a project for years, but unless you start it, it's never ever going to happen. So it was frustrating for me the way that people access content because videos and things weren't always working. Now I'm going to do a test. I'm going to see if they've been able to sort this problem out. Okay, so this is Arthur Seaton likes to have a drink, and preferably a fight, and preferably a bit of sex. And I was interested in the idea of community. What happens to community when pubs close down? Is it the same meeting up in Costa? Where do people go? Where do they vent off? How do they learn a kind of moral code, if you like? Because in the book, Arthur Seaton goes to the same pub. So he may sleep around with someone's missus, but somebody's going to know about it. And there's a kind of moral value there. Whereas I guess if we don't have pubs and people aren't interacting, what's happening to them? So I commissioned this writer, Al Needham, to look at his own life, 21 years through 21 pubs. So I just want to play a bit of it, A, to give you an idea of the different type of content, and B, to see if it works.
My name's Al Needham. and I'd like to tell you about the first 21 years of my life towed through the medium of pubs that don't exist anymore. I was born on my mum and dad's bed in Colton Hill in Nottingham in May of 1968. Obviously my mum was there with me. My dad was in a pub. He can't remember which one, but there were loads of them in Nottingham, so it could have been any of them. Could have been all of them, really. When I was 3 or so, we moved to Plimsoll Street in Ison Green, across the road from the Shipston's Brewery. Just as people in Nottingham chose between Forest and County when I was growing up, you found out very early that your dads were either Shippos men or O'Mails men. My dad was firmly Shippos at the time. Now the pub at the top of our street where he'd be after work, especially in the first week of October when me and my sister would hang out the window in agony waiting for him to take us to Goose Fair, was called the Oak General, and it was the first pub I got any memory of whatsoever, even though I never went in. The great thing about the Oak General is he actually had a dummy of the bloke himself above the pub in a glass case, and every Christmas they'd put a Santa suit and a beard on him, and that's when Ison Green knew that it was officially Christmas. I always thought that he was some kind of war hero from some Civil War or something like that, but it turned out that he was actually a local mentalist called Ben Watt, who used to get kids to chuck mud at school windows and then demand tuppence from the headmaster to make them stop. My dad's side of the family.
To give you an idea of some of the kind of content we produced there, thinking about the interactivity and the way that digital storytelling can tell different narratives, we went to the 21 pubs that Al used to drink at, and we found out they were all Tesco's or student flats or derelict parks. So working on the commission for the space with their remit of interactivity was a brilliant experience because it made me think about storytelling in a different way, in a way that when someone's actually talking and telling a story, how the photographs themselves could be folding over and telling an alternative narrative. So if you think about that, you've then got your Twitter feed. We then utilised Flickr because we wanted people to submit photographs based on the 5 locations, which we then used on a mobile app. So it became a really kind of interactive experience for us as people producing content. But again, when you actually go on the space, I don't know if you necessarily get that sense of interactivity. Just one other thing I wanted to just talk about very quickly about the space is there's all of this talk about digital technology being wonderful, how we've got to feed in content to different types of audiences, how we shouldn't follow something as prescriptive as a linear narrative. But the problem with that is when you put together a really complex project like this that's feeding into different types of art forms, how does the reader make sense of it? Because the point of this project was to raise awareness of the work of Alan Sillitoe. And if you came onto this page here, how would you know which content to go to first? Now, the Old Market Square is the first place that you go to. But which is next? Is it here? Is it the White Horse? Is it Raleigh? So I think that when putting together a project like this, there needs to be a little bit more emphasis on the actual narrative trail that you're taking. And I guess in the excitement to produce this creative kind of hub, this different thing, that got lost a little bit. Now what's happening with the space now is they're taking like a year or so out where they're looking at the content, they're looking at ways that they can think about how they're grouping information together. So hopefully it will improve. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much.
Just before I start, I thought it was quite interesting deconstructing Hillary's presentation slightly when I was watching it, talking about storytelling and narrative. I don't know if people noticed, but how many of the images you used were of children listening to stories, the 2 children on the sofa, the children listening around in the schoolroom, and you know the children's audience often does get sidelined a bit. But I passionately believe that we, you know, if we don't take care of our children's audience, then we don't have that audience of the future, which is why I think children's is particularly important around around PSB services. So, to give you some background, I represent the Children's Media Foundation, which is a relatively new organisation, came into existence about 18 months ago. The Children's Media Foundation acts on behalf of the children's audience to promote and protect the quality, variety and range of media for children and young people in all social groups, to support the production of media for children and young people in the UK whilst embracing stimulating content from all parts of the world, to increase public awareness and improve understanding of the value of media made for children, and also the issues arising from its production and distribution. I'm going to focus on the UK because that's the market I know about. I'm aware actually that, you know, for some of the people coming from other countries, I'm going to sound like a terrible whinger because we are very fortunate, and I know that. We have a fantastic, you know, public service broadcaster in the BBC. We have a pretty good children's service in many respects, but the reason we've got that is because we've defended it and we've supported it, and, you know, as I'm going to try and show, it's under severe threat. So, you know, I hope you don't see it as whingy. Also, the other point I was going to say is that the children's media market, although I'm focused on the UK, as I'm sure you know, the children's media market is completely global. It's unlikely you would get a project off the ground without either pre-sales in other territories or co-financing. So many of the observations and challenges that I'm going to refer to, I think they would apply to other countries, although with some important differences, obviously. So, what's the current situation? Well, the children's PSB service in the UK has been in fairly rapid and dramatic decline for the last 10 years. Within that overall decline, the BBC service is just about holding up. Although there are some question marks about the wider appeal of the BBC service and how well placed it is to cope with the challenges of the next 10 years. What's the evidence for that summary? Well, it is, I accept that it's a little bit of a crude measurement of PSB, but a good starting point is spend and output. These two things don't guarantee a high quality service, but if you don't have a competitive programming budget and a focus on new UK originated content, then you are clearly off to a bad start. The data I'm going to use is from Ofcom's 2012 PSB report, which gives us figures for 2011. Again, worth pointing out that 2 years is a very long time in the children's media market, and things will only got worse in the last 2 years. So year on year, the total hours of children's TV broadcast across all PSBs in the UK in 2011 remain more or less stable. We had 12,665 hours in 2010, dropping marginally to 12,547 in 2011. That sounds positive. 34 hours of children's TV a day across the public service broadcasters. So that's ITV, 5, Channel 4 and the BBC, because the private commercial companies also have a public service remit as part of their licence, which kind of includes children's, sort of. When you look at the spend, it's a slightly different picture. Overall spend fell by 6% from 108 million to 102 million in 2011. About the same hours for less money. How do they do that? Well, of course, they acquire programmes. You buy in programmes from other broadcasters and you reduce the spend on new runs. So when you look at the UK produced shows receiving their first transmission, UK first run spend, that spend figure dropped by roughly 3% from 91 million to 88 million. That in turn resulted in a fairly significant drop in hours for first runs. So in terms of first run hours, in 2010 the PSBs provided a total of 843 hours of UK originated programmes. That fell to 777 hours in 2011. You may be wondering whether or not 777 hours a year is a healthy total, and I will come back to that shortly, so we'll revisit that shortly. If we look at the longer term, trend for hours and spend, the figures are much worse. According to Ofcom, between 2006 and 2011, the total hours across the PSBs increased slightly. We have 12,336 in 2006 and 12,547 in 2011. In that same period, the total spend, that's the spend on acquired programmes and first runs, fell from 132 million to 102 million. So that's a pretty significant drop in the money that was available in those programme budgets. The spend on new UK originated content fell from 107 million to 88 million. Okay, so again, that's a fairly significant drop. And a staggering figure, the number of hours of new UK originated content dropped by nearly 50%, from 1,584 hours to the 777 hours that we just referred to in the previous slide. So 2006 to 2011, that was the picture for children's TV and also wider media as well. The other thing to bear in mind on this as well is that it's not even as if that position in 2006, which is our baseline, was particularly good. According to Ofcom's 2007 report, the 1,584 hours a year of new programming in 2006 amounted to just 1% of all children's programming. So what that means is in 2006, if a child in a multi-channel home was to switch on the TV, they would have had roughly a 1 in 100 chance of finding a new UK originated programme. And 2006, remember, that was the good old days. Okay? In fact, 2006, we'd seen a steady decline leading up to that, with ITV pulling out of children's production. So, the kind of traditional view of British kids TV as being this really strong powerhouse, that's old hat. That was back in the 1990s. It doesn't bear any resemblance to what we have now. There were two main reasons for the drop in hours between 2006 and 2011. ITV and Five continue to reduce spend. So they're peripheral players now in the kids market, really. They've just dropped out. They filled the schedules with acquired content, and if you look at the CITV website now, they're rerunning shows that I was involved in over 10 years ago. That's the core of their British content. The rest is just bought-in programmes. It was driven partly by increased competition in the market, their reduction, partly by the steady impact on their ad revenue as a result of the government's ban on junk food ads, which I wholeheartedly agree with, but there is a repercussion of that for that culturally. And it was partly a problem with the economic downturn, obviously, from 2008 onwards. The second reason for the big drop in figures was that the BBC began a new commissioning strategy called Fewer Bigger, and I think you're right, it was Fewer Bigger Better was the other bit, and I didn't leave that on, so Fewer Bigger Better. It did what it said on the tin. Fewer commissions, but bigger budgets for the shows that were commissioned. So obviously that resulted in a drop of hours. Again, it was partly a response to market competition. The BBC belatedly recognised that children's producers were being asked to create high quality shows that could compete in a global market with budgets that were a fraction of the equivalent programme budgets for programmes produced by some of their new commercial competitors in the UK. Never mind how they compared with the adult audience budgets, which children do measure against. If children watch a great show with their mum and dad, which has got terrific production qualities, then they expect to see the same when they switch on their channel. And the budgets the BBC and ITV before them had didn't really allow us to do that. So, as I say, this was, the BBC was now up against some very big competitors. Let's have a look at those competitors. There they are, the big beasts of children's media. I've included estimates of their annual revenues, and that's the annual revenues of the parent companies, obviously. So you know exactly what the BBC is up against, and obviously other national broadcasters in other European countries, because, these companies have got tremendous muscle in terms of the money they can spend on their programmes and how they market them and promote them in our territories. Also want to be clear, which I've already alluded to, when we talk about PSB, when I say the BBC is up against this, it's because when it comes to children's programming, children's public service broadcasting, we are talking about the BBC. Of the 777 hours of new PSB programming in 2011, 695 hours, 90%, were commissioned by the BBC. That's a massive change from, when I started working in the industry back in the 1990s. ITV was a major player, major competitor, and there was competition for programme ideas between ITV and the BBC. That's gone away. So the end result of that now is that if you have got an idea for a new children's TV show that's got a uniquely British feel, your first question is, will the BBC want it? If the BBC don't want it, then forget it. You might as well drop it. So this is the market that the BBC operates in. It's a market that has seen a steady rise in the popularity of the global media brands. According to Barb, in 2005, the commercial cable and satellite services, which actually include the CITV channel, I should mention that's important, but that accounted for 55% of children's viewing, 55% in 2005. In 2009, that share had risen to 66%. Oh, really? Seriously?
Seriously.
Okay. Okay, I'll rush through it. So, against the BBC, share of 31%. I'll extemporise on these. Okay, is that 777 hours enough, which I said I'd promised I'd return to? It's 2 hours a day of new programming, 2 hours a day. Think of that audience. It needs to be age appropriate. How different is a 5-year-old from an 8-year-old, or a 9-year-old from an 11-year-old? Gender. Do you have an hour of boy-skewed programming and an hour of girl-skewed programming? Life experiences, culture, community. How do you represent that in 2 hours a day? Tastes and interests. Some kids like animals, some kids like fashion, some kids like music, some kids like comedy, some want drama. How do you do that in 2 hours a day? Genre. Do you have mainly animation because that's what kids love? But if it's PSB, you want good factual programming, live entertainment shows, and crucially live action drama as well. BBC audience reach, that is a concern for us. Okay, this is to do with the nature of the BBC. BBC One, which is a general audience for adults, gets a reach of 78.2%. The BBC's children's channels, which are general channels for the children's audience, and this is a measurement of the children's audience. Whoops, let's go forward rather than back. CBeebies gets 43.3% of its target audience. CBBC gets 30% of its target audience. So there's an issue for us about whether the BBC is actually playing to a very small audience. Finally, anybody who wonders about whether or not PSB for kids is important, that's the Ofcom definition, our Ofcom regulator's definition of PSB. Informing our understanding of the world, stimulating knowledge and understanding, reflecting UK cultural identity, representing diversity and alternative viewpoints. I can't believe there's anybody who does not think that is important for the kids' audience. Thank you very much.
I'm very conscious that I get to speak to you all later, so I'll use Chair's privilege to open it out to questions first of all and come back. So do we have questions from the audience? Yeah, Martin.
I have one for Hilary specifically. You addressed a lot of the kind of challenges in telling stories and the opportunities to use different media for doing that. Is there a sense of a type of story which is a Channel 4 appropriate story, which fits their role as a public service broadcaster or as a brand, and are those two things one and the same in Channel 4's case?
Yeah, that's pretty much one and the same. Yes, absolutely there is. And it's defined, it's a difficult one to define because, and this is an issue we have with producers quite a lot, is trying to say, especially in ideas when you're rejecting ideas and the response is, it's just not very Channel 4. And they're like, yeah! So what it means is something that is bold, has, now obviously, as I list this, I'm really conscious that everyone's going to be listing Channel 4 programmes that aren't any of these things. Okay, this is the ambition. This is bold programming, that it has a fresh and contemporary feel, that it is British and reflects British culture and identity and diversity, that there is programming which shines a light on or gives voice to, or in some other way raises into a more public space audiences who don't normally get that kind of attention. So there, which points to diversity, and when we're talking about drama ideas, which is the area I spent most time in at Channel 4, it's either a story which we've never heard before, or it's a very fresh take on a story we think we already know. So they're kind of those are Channel 4 things. So that sort of bold contemporary feel are the things that I think are a point of distinction from the BBC. Channel 4 was set up to, be in competition with the BBC, as well as to stimulate the production sector, the independent production sector. So it has to have that point of distinction, and quite often that's one of the conversations that happens within commissioning around, is this actually to BBC to be on Channel 4, and vice versa, is this to Channel 4 to be on BBC, because we get ideas that have been put into turnaround by the Beeb as well.
Yeah.
This is a question for all of you. I'm really curious, because this is a conference on the place of public service broadcasting, and we are researchers, so my question concerns the place of public service broadcasting research. And my question is, do you use research from academia, like journal articles, in your work in the industry? And if so, in what way?
I would try to use any source that would enable me to widen the project. I'll give you an example of that now. The project I'm currently working on is called Dawn of the Unread, and it's going to bring back some literary figures from the dead who are coming back to Nottingham, because I'm very big on writing about my local area of 300,000 people. And I'm trying to get involved with the university at the moment to see if we can create a kind of research post, be it a PhD student that's already there or a new post, so they can research all of the thing I'm interested in is I'm looking at 10 literary figures that everybody knows about, and I thought about what about all the other literary figures that people don't know about, that didn't get into the libraries. So I'm actually in negotiations at the moment with the Dean of Arts and Humanities to see if we can create that post. So yes, definitely, if it keeps a subject talking about, because when you're telling a story, you want everyone to hear it, or as many people to hear it. So if it's beneficial, yeah, I would.
Colin, hello.
I think from my perspective, the children's media industry was very, very bad, and probably still is, in connecting in with the research community. That's maybe got slightly better recently, partly because we've been under pressure. When things started to go wrong, we went, this is ridiculous, we need to tell people how fantastic it is, we need research. And then all the researchers went, yeah, it's here, we've had it for ages, why have you not been listening or talking? So that, in terms of children's, that's beginning to change, I think. So we do, and in my role within the Children's Media Foundation is to build those links to support. We are supporting bids to the AHRC.
Yep.
Thank you. So, we're trying to encourage research in certain directions, help where we can, build those links between the industry and the researchers to make sure that it informs what happens in the industry.
I sort of have two hats in that I was working within broadcasters and now I freelance. And the range of research use varies a great deal. Within broadcasting, very little, to be honest. And actually outside, it's very little in terms of at the start of any kind of work. It's more a retrospective look about, did that work? You look to the researchers to tell you whether what you did was good enough. But yes, within broadcasting, and I think part of that is just not being connected, as you've just described. With the children's industry, this is a sort of a newer industry, so it's sort of at the stage that the children's industry was at, where it's not connecting in with academia or research to any great extent. And also because there's a pace to the work that we do, which is about okay, what's next? We've done that, what's next? What's next? What's next? And the time taken to review what has been done is quite small. I'm talking like an hour. I'm talking, there's a project wash up at the end of a project where you spend an hour with everybody who was involved talking about what worked and what didn't work, and then it's done, and you're on to the next thing, and you're generally looking for what haven't other people done in order to try something new. So no, there's not a huge amount of engagement with the research community, and I suspect it would be hugely beneficial to have more. I mean, I know as a sort of a tangential thing, one of the projects I was involved with Channel 4 was the Digital Fiction Factory, who come out of Salford Media City and have a huge amount of engagement with the BBC and BBC Children's as well, I think.
Yeah. I was going to say, as I said, that BBC Children's have been pretty good, and that goes back to 2002-03 stuff with Jackie Marsh at Sheffield, which they supported there. So the BBC,
So they have sort of an academic network that they plug into, and in fact we were looking for prototypes and proposals for prototypes for things which would go alongside some drama projects which we were exploring, hadn't been greenlit, but we're looking at, and some of those prototype proposals in fact came from universities as well. So we were engaging with them on level, but it's small stuff in the grand scheme of things.
But you tend to that thing about pace in response to that question is key, in that academic institutions, as much as us, perhaps can't necessarily move at the same pace. So you, for example, would be more likely to commission MTM London or a research kind of organisation that's a commercial kind of entity to do similar kinds of research, but not our academic.
Yeah, it's true, and I think that's one of the frequent pieces of feedback from the universities we were working with, or who were trying to pitch project ideas for us as well, was that the turnaround time for proposals between the brief being sent out and when we wanted proposals back in was too short for them to properly engage with. So there's a challenge there.
We take the approach as well that we would use the commercial researchers to get newspaper headlines and the academic researchers to try and influence government and change policy.
Petros?
To follow up this discussion a little bit, the regulatory body, the Ofcom, very much interested in this issue lately. We had invited representatives from Ofcom at City University to discuss about projects they were interested to collaborate with academia. And they said to us one of the major areas is children and the media, and the other one is convergence of technologies. Anyway, that's a different story. But to follow up this question, do you collaborate with Ofcom, or perhaps you use Ofcom publications for this particular area, children and the media?
For children's, yes, definitely. I mean, Ofcom's been fantastic, and James Thickett at Ofcom, to give him a name check, has been really supportive over this argument. And Ofcom have been, part of the speech you didn't hear actually, was that Ofcom have really been banging on about this to the politicians, saying, we are sleepwalking into a radically different children's media service, and you need to do something about it. But these weren't the best times to be going around and saying we need some financial support for the arts, as we.
No, and I'd say absolutely. The broadcasters I work with would certainly use Ofcom material that's come through Ofcom. Partly it's sort of awareness as well. It's how to find out when you're in work, when you're doing another job. How do you find out about these papers? And a mail shot comes from Ofcom because you subscribe to them because they're the regulator. You're more likely to just find out about the research that way.
Yeah, Claire.
This is a question for James. What's the future of the space funding-wise?
I can't remember how much they invested first of all, but they did keep adding to it. So they spent a lot more than they wanted to originally, and I think that's because they were excited by how much content they had. They had to let a lot of really good work go. The idea at the moment, I guess, is they just want a year, 2 years to really look at what's working, look at the audience figures. I'm going down to London at the end of July, where we're going to find out a lot more about how many people have been visiting and that kind of thing. And I guess based on that, they will give more commissions. Now, my interpretation of the space is they're creating this platform for ordinary organisations and local organisations that have got good content to upload. So in that sense, I guess if you can kind of create something yourself and you need a space, I think they'll create that space. Whether there's going to be a lot more money,
I
who
think I
knows?
saw they just announced they're going to have 8 million for the next round.
For the next round.
For the next round.
Is that
from
more
Arts
or less than
Council.
they had first time?
Yeah, I think that's less than they had last time because the BBC match kind of funded it in the support that they offered. But I think they just announced it just like a couple of weeks ago or something. So there's some money there, as you say. Yeah. But I'm interested in that kind of experience that you had, James, and your experience with working at Channel 4, Hilary, is that attempt to reimagine what Petros talked about earlier is public service broadcasting, as public service media, where we're moving into these, trying to be interactive, trying to do something different. And so the question for maybe both of you, and maybe Colin, you come in on it as well, is experimentation rationale enough for public service broadcasting? Is just experimenting a good enough reason to get into the space of online? Is that a good enough reason to do public service online?
Well, I think you've got to adapt. I think that's the bottom line. Adapting, you can call it experimentation, you can call whatever you like. There is a different market, there is a different audience now. The world has completely changed. I mean, I don't have a telly, for example, but it doesn't mean I don't watch telly. I do it on a laptop and occasionally pay my licence fee. You've got to adapt. You've got to look at different ways of doing it. And I think the only way you can learn is by experimenting. Like I say, some things on the space worked really well, others didn't. And I do genuinely believe that they will really think about those problems and address them. Just to give you a little example of something, we were told that when you were producing content for different kinds of mobile devices and iPads, you had to think of a strong visual image, because they said that's what's going to draw people in. We had to produce everything in high definition so that it could be accessible on the new iPhone when it came out. And then when the content was produced, there was just a little picture. And it was kind of like, why are we thinking differently about work and you're talking about adapting and experiment, and then you're not actually doing it? But again, I think that was a time issue, and I think that will change with the second round.
That sounds like a standardisation issue as well, in terms of just having a set of guidelines which they can then give out to everybody who's making something for this one platform. It's really hard to work on a bespoke model. Experimentation for its own sake, I don't think so, but experimentation for the sake of learning, absolutely. So it's R&D.
Yeah.
And it's editorial R&D. You have, the BBC does still have its R&D division, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. They're doing technological R&D around broadcasting. This is about evolving new forms of editorial when you're talking to audiences who are consuming not on a TV, who are, if you're watching, and we have connected TVs in some living rooms, but definitely just around the corner. And when you're talking to people who are watching on their laptops, well, they've got the whole internet behind that TV screen. That it's an alt tab away. So yeah, absolutely. But I think it's really important to learn from that experimentation and then apply that learning and develop it. So one of the things that we try to do, particularly with returning series like Skins and Misfits, and was sort of partly underway for Utopia when I left, was your first series is always just sort of a bit, okay, we think this will do something. And then you see what works, and you do more of what works for the next series, and then you try some other stuff as well. So you've got your stuff you can bank, and then you put some new stuff in, and then of the new stuff you see what works. And sometimes the old stuff's kind of died away, either because that platform, Bebo's not cool anymore, MySpace isn't cool anymore, but other platforms have suddenly mushroomed out in the year between Series 1 and Series 2. And you sort of adapt that way, so you kind of, it's not perfect, but it's sort of a roughly 80-20 kind of model, and out of that evolve formats, and you end up with multi-platform formats which you can then apply to similar types of shows. So there is definitely a format around creating social young adult drama for shows that work like Skins and Misfits, and you can see very distinct similarities between the multi-platform between them, and it works in other genres as well. So live nature documentaries on Channel 4 started with Hippo Live, which was a decaying hippo watched for a week, and then there was Foxes Live, and then they had Easter eggs live, and that was
Hippo
I keep thinking
Live.
It was a dead hippo on the banks of the Zambezi River.
Okay.
The broadcast was live, the hippo was not.
Yeah.
But the vultures and the hyenas and everything else was very, very alive. And But yeah, so there's a format, and because out of those formats you're learning about editorial engagement, but there are also production skills that have to spool out of that as well. So in a drama context, it's about writing for different platforms. We're asking script writers to write in dialogue in bites of 140 characters or less, and for live natural history programs, you're asking presenters to engage with an audience who are participating online while the program's on air, but also online when the program's not on air, so you're having little moments of dropping in and out. So there's lots of production skill that sort of comes off the back of that as well. So yeah, I think it's really, really important, because you're not going to go from now to 10 years' time where media consumption is going to be, it will be very, very different. Just at a flick of a switch, it's a process of evolution.
Colin, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I was going to say that for the children's audience, in terms of moving into different media, we don't tend to refer to it as experimentation. We call it catching up with the audience. And for the BBC, they have got to move into that space, because if they don't, they will lose their audience. The biggest thing that's happened in children's media over the last 3 years in the UK probably has been Moshi Monsters, which is an online gaming community. Moshi has made millions. It's been sold all over the world in many territories around the world. It's established itself, and just to show the way that children's media has changed. The last show that I produced, I was an executive producer recently, but as a producer, I produced a show called Raven. And Raven was a game show, and we worked with BBC Online and said, yeah, we'd like a game, please, to go with our TV show, and we'll tell you roughly what the game should look like and all of that. And now Moshi Monsters are saying, right, we've got this fantastic game, we'll tell you what kind of TV series we want as a spin-off from that. It's completely flipped around.
The technology that audience are growing up with, they're not having to learn it from scratch. So my nephew is 2.5, and he tries to change TV channels by swiping the TV screen. And he's not alone in that regard. So, the devices that are coming to the fore to answer that behaviour will fundamentally change the types of content that sit on them as well.
Yep, okay.
So this is a bit of experimenting work.
Sure.
I keep thinking, we keep talking about how everything's changed, and I wonder if it's really changed so much, because in a way what we're having now is a very or what you're describing is a very distracted view or a very distracted form of engagement with television, where you maybe engage with other things online at the same time, and you learn, or you switch between screens. But I wonder if that's so different from what we used to do when we turned around to talk to each other, or walked out of the room to make a cup of tea, or basically I'm just trying to be saying, is it really that different?
I don't think people are so different anymore. No, I think I completely agree. Yeah, we used to leave the room. The difference is now we know.
That's exactly right.
Now we know, and also now there are so many other pieces of content competing for that audience, and those pieces of content are paid for because they're measured, because the eyeballs are measured. So before it was sort of okay, we think roughly this audience, and also there were only 3, then 4, then 5 channels. And now there's bazillions of channels, so that audience is spread very, very thin, very, very distributed across hundreds and thousands of pieces of content, and you only earn money for the eyeballs that look at your content, for the duration in which they look at it. That's a very different business model for the people creating that content, which is why it's of greater concern, would be my argument.
I just thought one great thing with the space, which is a benefit when you're thinking about producing something, is I'd never ever thought about the many different relationships you can build with people, the different ways you can engage with the different topics on Twitter, for example. And when you actually see the figures, the amount of people that draws into your content, and then, like you say, you can go to someone, look, this is how many people read this, now I want funding for this, or etc. So definitely.
We've probably got time for one last question, Marty.
Well, picking up on that idea of the way that audiences engage with content, one of the things that strikes me as potentially worrying, especially in the notion that we can now see what people are doing, is that what we're really seeing is what some people are doing. We're seeing a very particular model of viewer behavior, and it's highly engaged, it's networked, it's tech savvy. and there's a very real chance that that type of viewer gets much more attention, gets much more targeted at them, especially in a part commercially funded broadcaster like Channel 4, where that type of viewer is also the one who's most likely to spend money to reward the broadcaster for programming things that they like. In some ways, that strikes me as the big challenge for public service media, that they want to be able to take advantage of all of this diversity, all of this choice, all of this technological variety, but doesn't that lead to this possibility that you're really only catering to that segment of consumers, which is hard to define and may very well not be a majority, in fact probably isn't a majority, who are really passionately engaged through social media with that television text?
I can step in, but yes, the way viewing is measured means that, and I'll speak for Channel 4 on this one because it was because the measuring got better, and it's the most recent example I have, means that you can see there are some things we don't know. So there are some things around we don't know how many people who are engaging socially are engaging with that broadcast. What we can see are things like how many people watched this live at time of transmission, how many people caught up, watched on TV, and how many people caught up on VOD. So we have those proportions as sort of rules of thumb of levels of engagement. And they vary a great deal between programme to programme, also between genre. The £1 Million Drop was held up as a massively interactive entertainment show. 8% of that audience were playing along with the online game. So we would, one of the things about that show is making sure that it works for the linear, for the people who are watching live. And I'd say it's the same. Certainly, it's the same for drama as well. It's got to work as a thing on its own. Also because you don't know when people are watching, right? You don't know if they're watching it when you broadcast it or if they're watching it 6 months hence because somebody gave them a DVD. So you have to make sure that story works. There are some dramas where over 50% of viewing was on demand, was not that live viewing. So there is a big shift. And drama's sort of the most time shifted of all the genres, and news and current affairs, I think, and sport are the least. So yeah, so there is a range of experience in there, and thus far, the big mantra is that the programme has to work if you're not participating. It has to work for an audience who are not participating. A lot of the programme, the producers don't make their money from making shows for Channel 4. They make their money from selling that show to America. So it's got to work as a thing in itself that can be sold. So at the moment, I don't think it's a very great risk so far.
That might be a good place to leave it. It's got to work, as I'm conscious of time. So thank you very much for giving up your valuable time to us today and giving a chance for us to ask you a question. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.